The right to vote was never given to the American people. It was fought for. From the founding of America to today, millions of people have struggled, protested, and even died to secure this fundamental freedom. So, who were these people? What effects did their actions have on us today? And what can we do to keep what they fought for going? To figure that out, we have to start at the beginning. On February 4th, 1789, George Washington was elected to be the first President of the United States of America. However, it was far from a fair election. Early on in U.S. history, the only people who could cast their vote in elections were white men that owned land. This restriction meant that all women, African Americans, Native Americans, and anyone else who didn't check all three boxes would be unable to participate in any elections. As we know now, though, these people wouldn't stand for this. Voting wasn't meant to be a privilege for a select few, and those who had been excluded from the process would make their voices heard. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man turned abolition leader, fought fiercely for black men's voting rights. His efforts would lead to the creation of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which, on paper, would allow men of any race to cast their vote in an election. However, the United States government would take steps to circumvent this and continue to prevent men of color from voting in ways we'll get to later. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the women's suffrage movement would start to gain momentum across the country. Its most prominent leader, Susan B. Anthony, was a co-founder of the National Women's Suffrage Association and fought for the right for women to vote for much of her life. Her efforts would pave the way for the creation of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on sex. However, the fight was still far from over. Even after the 15th Amendment was in place, millions of black Americans were still forcefully kept out of voting booths through various methods. One of these methods was the poll tax, which was a fee that voters had to pay in order to vote. This fee was minor and inconsequential to most white voters, but the same could not be said for many African American voters. A large amount of African American families were poor, and the money that would go towards poll tax could go to essentials like food or bills just as easily. Another method was literacy tests. On paper, they were meant to ensure that voters were educated and could make good decisions on who to vote for. In practice, they primarily targeted the immigrant and black voters with nonsensical questions with correct answers being completely up to interpretation by those administering the test. Among these questions were baffling requests like, spell backwards forwards, write right from the left to the right as you see it spelled here, and divide a vertical line into two equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisection of the vertical. Clearly, these tests were designed to be failed. People wouldn't stand for this, and voting rights were a critical issue of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They fought for their right to vote at protests like the Selma marches. Martin Luther King Jr. even participated in the movement, calling for change. That change would come in 1965, when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which banned discriminatory practices like the poll tax and literacy tests. Today, the efforts of those who fought for the right to vote live on, with voting becoming more and more accessible as time goes on. We've seen advances like mail-in ballots and new in-person voting locations. But while their contributions live on, so does their fight. We've seen attacks on our democracy, and protests against these attacks as recently as today. The only way that we can make sure voting stays fair is if we keep fighting for it to be so. With that, I leave you with a quote. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Democracy is built by those who show up. Every vote is a voice, so honor those who fought by using yours.